Hello again everyone, welcome back to my bookish channel. I'm here with Socks, who's sleepy because he was up all night. On Saturday morning he was up all night running back and forth. Jeremy was out all night at a DJ thing and they both didn't come in till about 3 or 4 o'clock, by which time I'd fallen asleep reading Storyland by Amy Jeffs, which I got yesterday on a trip into town. It's something I've meant to read for a long time. I bought it for a friend for Christmas a couple of years ago. It's a kind of digging into the mythology of Britain by somebody who specialises in, I think this is right, in medieval texts and medieval ways of looking at the world. And through these stories, she's creating a kind of mythology in the way that we have those wonderful books of myth cycles for ancient Greece and the Nordic countries, usually written by Roger Lancelin Green. Whenever I've whenever I've read lots of mythology, the ones that have always leapt out are the Puffin books by Roger Lancelin Green, which is one of the reasons I ended up writing my own Josephine and the Argonauts a couple of years ago. And he tells them in such a way that they make one complete story with little tributaries going off in the way that myth works. And you can see she's working on a similar thing here, weaving together the fairy tales and myths we know about the founding of the British Isles and the different clans and gods and monsters and giants, and also this idea that she begins the book with of, in the Middle Ages, Britain being the most western edge of the world. And there's a map from the Middle Ages that shows you how they thought about the shape of the world then, that we were on the brink of the unknown. And that's why everybody gathered here, to peek over the edge into what was next, into the future. And that's why Britain has always been filled with all kinds of people from all over the world getting along together, and why stories are, and languages are at such a kind of froth of invention in this particular country. And it just makes sense to me completely, that idea that it's always been a big broth, an imbroglio, I think is the right word. Is that how you pronounce it, with a silent G? Like my own name. Imbroglio of stories and people. Anyway, she illustrates her own book with lino cuts, which is something I remember doing at school years ago, digging into lino with a little tool. And she's done a couple more apparently since this. I like the way she writes. There's some lovely descriptive stuff. There's some lovely digging into people's thoughts, these mythological people. I think she's clever and informed. And I like that. And it's a beautifully produced book. Anyway, so that was me in FOP yesterday. We have a FOP shop. We've had it for years, where there's records and DVDs and books, and the books tend to be 2 for £7, all new, all kind of hand chosen by whoever buys the books for FOP. And they're usually rock biography and science fiction and odd non-fiction. And I like that about it. So I got this alongside this, Sweet Dreams, the story of the New Romantics by Dylan Jones, whose book on David Bowie I've read, or dipped into anyway. This is a kind of anecdotal history of the New Romantic movement and all the people involved. And looking at it, one of the last photos is David at Live Aid in his lilac suit, pale powder blue suit. Really interesting that it's organised like this, because it's just like George Plimpton's brilliant book on, it's an anecdotal history, just quotes from the people involved. George Plimpton's book about Truman Capote from 1998 which is one of my favourite books ever, contains hardly any words by George Plimpton himself. It's composed of quotations, and his thought was that we should move through the book as if we were at a wonderful party in which everybody is gossiping about the subject of the book, Truman. And I thought that's a fantastic way to organise a non-fiction book. If I was to do one, I'd write one about UEA, perhaps, and interview people and talk to people and take quotes from places. Because in some ways that was a very odd literary party to be at. Anyway, it looks like really good fun. And so we sat reading bits from these in a new bookshop that we visited after we'd been to FOP called House of Friends and Books, which is very sweet, very modern in the sense that it's a bit hipster and rainbow clad and just sweet. It's well-meaning. It's a bit Instagrammable as a bookshop. I'm sure you know the kind of indie bookshop that I mean. And it's very welcome in Manchester, where we've been starved of bookshops for way too long, I think. And they had very odd tea that was nice and tasted of toffee. And they had the new T.J. Klune, which I was kind of tempted to buy. It's a sequel to the Cerulean Sea novel that I read a couple of years ago that I thought was all right. I didn't go a bundle on it like everybody else did, but I almost got that, but I didn't. I held off because I'd already bought things. Yes, what else? The interesting thing about that bookshop was when you went through to the back to go to the loo, there was a dining room that was wood panelled. It's on the ground floor of this very grand building on King Street. And there was a sign saying that this used to be the premises of the Liberal Reform Club, the Liberal Party, in the 1870s, where they would meet and have dinner and talks and plan. And Winston Churchill and various other luminaries were members. And you could suddenly get a whisper of all these people chattering away in the middle of Manchester being liberal, which meant something slightly different then in those days. I think they were closer to Tories, but I'm not sure. I'll have to find out. We went to Forbidden Planet, or I did, and got comics. Every 6 months or so, I dip into what's going on with comics. They're so expensive now to buy individual issues, and if you buy the first in a series, it is just warming up. If you buy the middle of a series, it's kind of mystifying. So you've just got to dip in. And I ended up buying Spider-Boy, which is this kind of expanding world of the Spider-Man family. All the characters on the front were people like Doctor Strange and the Green Goblin, and I thought, oh, they're all going to be in, but none of them are in it. It's the beginning or part of a kind of a massive saga again, but it has that down-at-home feel of the Spider-Man stories I loved. Making the lead character much younger is much more like the original Steve Ditko stories with Stan Lee. And so that's kind of very welcome. In some ways, when they let all the superheroes and characters grow up and have adult concerns, they miss the point, really. They're meant to be young people struggling with powers in the world. That's the point of those kinds of stories. Where else? We also went to the... there's a bookstall at the back of the Arndale Shopping Centre, which is a kind of 60s shopping mall in the middle of town that has seen many changes. It's been bombed, it's been refurbished. At the back of it, there's a row of market stalls that have been there for 40 odd years, 43 years, I think. And maybe 10 or 15 years ago, they were refurbished and made shiny and new and metallic, as opposed to their ramshackle old wooden selves. It used to be like a bit of a shanty town. Not in keeping at all, really, with the modern, slightly Mussolini-esque city centre of Manchester. You know, all the shiny new buildings that they keep throwing up. They knock down the 18th, 19th, 20th century buildings and replace them with these soulless, horrible skyscrapers that people seem excited about. but they kind of heat up the city centre and destroy um, the kind of ground level vibe of the city. Anyway, so these 4 or 5 stalls are due to be demolished alongside the 70s block behind them. One of them is a bookstore. There was a Caribbean fruit and veg stall. There was another food shop. There used to be a burger shack and a record store, but those are long gone. The food stalls went recently, the last couple of weeks, and the last man standing is this fella with a bookstall that's very dusty and gritty because he stands by the edge of a main road where the trams go by, and he has a big barrow, really, of books for £1, paperbacks for £1, and there would always be kind of magic turning up there. Stuff that would come from warehouses and personal collections and all sorts. And for the 23 years that we've lived here, I would always stop by and have a dig through. And I remember one year going into town very early to have a kind of mooch around the cafes and write. It's when I was writing in town all day long, and being there for kind of opening time. And he'd had a big consignment of something, of from a warehouse, of books and books and books. And for some reason, he had the entire run of the Virgin New Adventures, the Doctor Who books of the 1990s. All of them in prime condition on his pound stall. And no sooner had he put them out in the heaps of £1 books than people just appeared from nowhere, like gannets at the seaside. Doctor Who fans appearing from nowhere and just bought them almost instantly, or at least by lunchtime. So you couldn't dither. And yesterday we stopped by because we'd seen him on Facebook being interviewed about the closure of his stall that he'd been on for 43 years. And he was pretty cross, you could tell in this interview, and candid, which people never are on the local news, are they? They're people are always putting their best gloss on things and living their best life, and you hear lots of perfectly formed phrases about why what's happening is really a good thing. We live in a very odd era, I think, of people making up their own propaganda about their lives, positivity. And he wasn't positive at all. He said, this is going after 43 years and all this work. And the interviewer asked him, has Manchester changed much in those 43 years? And he looked flabbergasted, of course it had. And he said, I'll tell you how it's changed. I came into work early one morning on Monday this week, and when I came to my bookstall, there was blood spattered all down this pavement from something that had happened in the night. And he said, that's how Manchester's changed, which is a bit frightening, really, but vivid. Somebody who was telling the truth about where he is in this stall, the back of the Arndale Centre, and how the world has changed. Anyway, I was there and I picked up 2 last things from this bookstore, purely for pleasure, by Margaret Lane, who was a biographer. And this is a 1966 collection of biographical essays and sketches that she wrote, the kind of trimmings of larger biographical works. It begins with it's all sorts of people, Dickens and Beatrix Potter, Jane Austen, Mrs. Gaskell, Dr. Johnson, kind of good, canonical people. And she's looking at odd corners of their lives. She talks about Robert Browning's scorn for biographers and who cares what John Keats had for breakfast, what his porridge was, who cares? But she does. And here she writes, at the beginning of this, an essay about Flora Thompson, the working class person, the woman who wrote Lark Rise to Candleford, the trilogy of novels that she wrote in her 60s and 70s, over 10 years, at the end of her life. And she'd had this rural childhood in Oxfordshire, a bit like, and about the same time as, Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie. And actually, when they filmed Lark Rise about 10 or 15 years ago, it was very like a British version of Little House, actually. Very clever what they did. They took those books and did the same thing with them. It's about a family growing up in rural poverty, but about the wider world encroaching on their idyll. It's an idyll, but it's also full of hardships, of course. Country life was tough. Anyway, so she writes this. I've read the first essay, and the introduction she's talking about, and she is writing, she's talking about the biographer's work and how when people destroy letters upon somebody's death, it's the end of the line. And as far as she was concerned, having learned about the destruction of lots of Flora Thompson's letters, there was no more to be learned. So she's there rescuing things from the brink, stories at the brink. There's that theme again. And I find that really fascinating. And she writes really well, just having read that little bit. And also a children's book from 1980 published by Jonathan Cape that I'd not heard of, Under Plum Lake by Lionel Davidson, which is, I've read the first third actually this morning without thinking about it. It's a kid in Cornwall who runs away at night and gets into the sea and finds caves, and beyond them a kind of fantasy world which we haven't got into yet. But it's written so grittily. Grittily's not the word because that sounds like it's harsh. It's written so exactly. You feel like you're there in the middle of this. So it's interesting so far. It looks like kind of a Narnia thing, the way it's presented, beautifully done. I don't think books are quite like this. Well, they can be, but this was, I think all books were like this. They were just nicely made. I think now you have to pay a bit more for them to be like that. Anyway, stop being an old fart and complaining. I got a parcel this morning. It's another parcel from Cromford Collector's Corner, and Ian there with his comic shop in Cromford. And I sent off my postal order. It's not a postal order, it's PayPal, for another mystery parcel. The last time I did that was about 6 months ago, I think. And my prompt this time was I wanted vintage Halloween or vintage Batman, because my Batman phase is still there. I've been going through. The parcel's arrived this morning. It's a kind of open, which is a bit disconcerting. To I think it's just burst open perhaps, because there's so much in it. So I'm gonna open this now and see what comics I've got. They're all really nicely bound up, and I can see straight away the demon. That looks like Jack Kirby, that art on the front. I don't know if it is. It's a DC thing from probably the 60s. That does look like Jack Kirby. You see these, the inking where everything, including people's flesh or fabric, looks like it's fashioned from kind of chrome and steel, and the way his highlights and shadows work is like everybody's metallic. So he's very noticeable, identifiable Jack Kirby, I think. Although lots and lots of people, of course, because he was such an influential figure, lots of people copied the way that he worked, consciously or not. Right, here's the whole set. See. So there's demon, part man, part elemental fury. He stalks the dark of night in search of fearful enemies. I think this is the 60s. It's Jeremy getting in on the video again. 1975, later than 73. But you see, DC were always slightly more old-fashioned, I think. They were from a different time. And it is Jack Kirby. It's written and drawn by him. That's quite exciting. I've not seen this. I've not heard of it. Be interesting to see what it's like when he has his whole way with the story. He gets to write as well as draw it. I wonder if that's why he went to DC. I don't know the history of that. And here's the Batman Gallery. I don't know what this is, the Batman Gallery. It's number 1. And these are so nicely packaged up in, it looks like the 90s, doesn't it? Kind of post-killing joke. I don't know where I get all this memory of, all this kind of knowledge of comics. I haven't got much, but I do kind of remember the highlights, I suppose, of my reading life in comics. I wish I knew more, really. Yeah, this looks like, oh, it's 91. Oh, no, it's not, that's it. It's a kind, yeah, the whole thing is a kind of a history of covers and artwork. It must be much more recent because it's got a few very recent things by the looks of it. I'll find out when this is from. Okay, Man-Thing. Bronze Age Marvel, number 12, 8p. I was complaining the other day about how there used to be a little narrow newsagent at Manchester Piccadilly. Now it's all glitzy with it's all restaurants and cafes and fancy takeaways, antiseptic and all chains on the rounded curve as you walk up to Manchester Piccadilly. And there used to be a narrow newsagent right next door to the off-license. And they would always have American comics in the way that those places always had, a random selection, a thick batch of comics. And they often did grab bags, as they called them, where they would package together 10 random comics that they kind of were overstocked with or couldn't get rid of. And they would package them together right at the front of the shop. This is when newsagents had all the foreign press, all the magazines, every specialism, every oddity. It just seems such a rich and eclectic and generous world, and one that, you know, we still had up until about 10 or 15 years ago, and it's just gone. It's like Darlington Indoor Market, which is so nice now with its food stalls and things, but that amazing magazine and newsstand that they used to have, where when I was a kid I would buy Charlton comics and Gold Key comics and DC and Marvel. It just seems astonishing that that's gone, and you could buy anything in any language should you want to. This is Man-Thing from 1974. Yep, they're just little treasure troves, aren't they? They're spooky and another Batman detective comics. Maybe early 2000s, I would think. GI Combat featuring the Haunted Tank from DC. I've never heard of the Haunted Tank. King Kong. This is an awful lot in this parcel. Son of Satan, number 3. With what looks like, that's not Doctor Strange. No, that's somebody with lots of heads. That just looks fab. There was such a kind of an occult strand of horror and monsters through 70s, and mysticism through 70s Marvel that fascinates me. I grew up thinking that was normal, and you look back and it was very odd really. Superboy, starring the Legion of Superheroes, and that's great because of my recent obsession with things like Legends of Tomorrow and all those DC TV shows, which seem like a kind of updating of 60s DC with these huge casts of characters and colourful villains. I've never actually had anything from that time. Oh, a spin-off Legends Chapter 6. That's interesting. I wonder if this is related then to, it must be, to exactly what I'm talking about. See, I would never know where to start. This is the thing about sending off to a comics expert in a comics shop. If you say, you know, find me something, find me this or that, or surprise me, they will. And it'll be stuff that you don't know about, that you wouldn't know about to look for if you were in the shop. This is Dark Delicacies, issue 1. Joe R. Lansdale and F. Paul Wilson, who were novelists. I'm not sure what this is. Oh, that looks like Fu Manchu. I think it's a comics take on Fu Manchu. I love the Fu Manchu stories, and they're kind of a bit, I hate the word cancelled, but I think they're lesser known or less well thought of these days. The Sax Roma stories of the 1910s and 20s, set in, you know, Limehouse, because they were essentially racist. The idea of Chinese people being nefarious. And it's a shame that the fiction has to lose out, because they were great stories. One of my favourite takes on them is actually a sequel by Kay Van Ash, who was Sax Roma's apprentice, really, his protege. And he wrote 2 team-ups between, battles between Fu Manchu and Sherlock Holmes. One of them is called 10 Years Beyond Baker Street, and I read it when I was about 9. This huge thick novel, and I loved it. I bought it in Fine Fair, the supermarket, when they had a kind of reduced books bay at some point in the late 70s. They had very odd books there. I guess they were remaindered American books. And that was a big deal. And I got it again in recent years. And it just transports you to that kind of smoky, dimly lit, frightening Victorian world of Fu Manchu, which hopefully this will do as well. So that's a great parcel of superheroes and spookiness. Thank you, Ian. Wow, I've done another unboxing on my channel. So that's my heap of stuff just from yesterday and today. People are remarking on how stuff-filled my study is. Don't worry. It's dimensionally transcendental. I'm going to go. I will... Jeremy, you're not creeping back from the shower with nothing on, are you? Because the camera's facing that way.
Oh, you finished?
I'm going to go. See you again soon in the next episode. Goodbye.